lot of things in metal that are deemed silly or like melodramatic, but there's a certain honesty in that, you know. There's a certain honesty in the fucking picked on loner fucking screaming his head off and playing powerful guitar, you know what I mean? So I'm not saying that everybody is a picked on loner that makes metal, but some of the things that appeal to me about it. So.
Contact with humanity to a bare minimum, but I've found that as the years go by, the solitude that I used to enjoy so much is becoming a problem. It's more like a window into depression, because I think I've had long-term solitude, and that's what the main effect has been. I've spent too much time alone, and it drives you a bit nuts.
Is a mirror of my mind, but what's worse is that it's a mirror of other people's minds, and that's
the despair. You mean, like the
just more than that, just kind of hate, fear, death. The other thing that's like not really very understood is that I don't recall ever making claims I can't back up in my lyrics, like I'm going to kill myself. I don't do that. But instead what I do is I just say, hey, here's a few reasons for you listening to this. You might want to look into dying and killing yourself. You might want to look into that.
Depression, sadness, and hopelessness have been common emotions evoked in music for centuries, possibly millennia. The use we get from such music varies, whether it's to cope with or validate life's struggles, to bring attention to some evil or injustice, or perhaps just to gain fleeting satisfaction wallowing in misery. In more recent times, the genre of metal, while additionally providing a wide range of emotions and feelings to evoke, has succeeded enormously in conjuring the deepest and darkest pits of despair to wallow in, notably culminating in a style of black metal known as DSBM, or depressive suicidal black metal, as well as many other styles such as funeral doom, various synthy shit, and lots of folk metal. Yes, lots of folk metal is depressing as fuck. Aforementioned metal such as these provide some of the most visceral and intense sensations of hopelessness in all of music, the gut-wrenching screams and dissonance of Zaster, or the ever-sinking abyss of Bellwitch. However, hopelessness in metal is not limited to the obvious depressive intentions of DSBM or funeral doom. The Lovecraftian sensation of existential meaninglessness can be obtained via various death and black metal artists, painting pictures of such overwhelming chaos and destruction that any hope at there being a point in this world is lost in a cacophonic sea of cursed riffs and inescapable percussive force. It doesn't end there. Even if the extremity of metal is acknowledged as harmless or even emotionally beneficial, we see hopelessness take root in the dashed dreams of countless musicians, not being able to musically perform at a level sufficient to be accepted by the ever-growing exclusivity of the scenic authorities. In fact, the music of extreme metal and the people who partake in it have extensive intimacy with the concept of hopelessness, being expressed and coped with in a variety of forms. This is not to ignore or denounce the extensive positive impact extreme metal has had on many people, especially emotionally, including myself. But for something to have an uplifting effect on someone, is a position of lowliness and depression not predicated? The hopelessness in life can understandably warrant the obsession or hopefulness of death. Here we see the extensive thematic inclusion of death, darkness, cynicism, evil, nihilism, misanthropy, and everything contrary to the meaning or meaningfulness of life, in an armchair philosophical manner or in more dedicated spiritual commitments. As it pertains to extreme metal, philosophy should be more than a sop to the pathetic twinge of human self-esteem. In a general sense, lots of those involved in extreme metal begin their experience with a sense of dissatisfaction and anger, growing into despair and depression, culminating often in nihilistic hopelessness. The 80s and early 90s drove generations of young people into hopelessness by the perpetual threat of nuclear annihilation and societal vilification. The late 90s and 2000s abandoned any last shred of the American dream and saw the single world power perpetuate unnecessary violence on a global scale. And the 2010s and 20s solidified us in our current state of hyper-alienation and digital entrapment. Hopeless youth in the late 80s and early 90s found a vital escape in thrash and early death metal, even potentially affirming capitalist aspirations of making it big, with the music industry push to popularize death metal. But even at its most successful, death metal failed to overcome its inherent extremity, mainly falling back into insular circles and only remaining in the mainstream as a wacky aesthetic or skin to cosplay or play around with, furthering feelings of despair and hopelessness within those most closely attached. This hopelessness manifested itself into black metal in the 90s, a response to the sin of attempted mainstream success and failure of death metal. Black metal achieved its own levels of success and emergences into tiny pockets of the mainstream, but, similarly to death metal, fell back into its own isolated wallowing grounds, again only remaining in the mainstream as yet another kooky, crazy character in the expansive museum of dead or dying culture. New experiments such as nu metal, metalcore, and the new wave of American heavy metal brought many fans into the greater umbrella of metal music, just as even newer fusions of metal with trap, shoegaze, EDM, and various alternative musical styles did. But those already accustomed to the superficial highs and woeful lows of extreme metal were well aware of the fate awaiting these intrepid advances. Fred Durst, tattooed necks, and Old English font all found their way onto the all-encompassing display shelves of the Museum of Commodification. This isn't to say that there wasn't a pride in extreme metal music and a flourishing of the underground throughout the decades, but the now obvious fact that extreme metal itself, something valued and nigh worshipped for its alleged abrasive, inaccessible, and subversive character, wasn't immune to the forces of commoditization. At best, this realization is taken with a shrug of the shoulders and a further plunge into escapism. At worst, we see the ever-popular and glorified sinking into despair, nihilism, and hopelessness of our current black-pilled and doomerist internet age. Sentiments such as these, taking shape in a number of forms and throughout several generations, and commonly looked at as the poignant works of modern-day philosophers, are all rooted in a reaction to the present reality, specifically the material conditions and societal currents taking place, of which that reaction is most often a reaction of denial and escape. When speaking of the psychedelic movements of the 60s, the de facto ancestor of heavy metal, and a recurrent trend in contemporary times, Mike Watson, in his book Hungry Ghosts in the Machine, explains this strong sense of denial. It is nothing new to say that psychedelic use expresses a desire for escapism, though it is not simply an escape from reality. It's an escape from a specific social and economic structure that itself remains unchallenged by our brief sojourn into oneness with all things. Escapism, after all, is a form of running away, not of deep engagement and transformation. Similarly to the psychedelic users of the 60s, nihilistic black pillars of today seeking an escape via a vindictive meme or DSBM album, oftentimes also in tandem with psychedelics or various intoxicating substances, assume a profound stance on society and reality. But when the LSD wears off, or the album finishes, you still have to clean the fryer at McDonald's on Monday, or whatever job you have, blah blah blah. It's no coincidence that an escapist movement of the 60s has much in common with the escapist movements of today. Jacques Derrida, and later Mark Fisher, elaborate on the concept of hauntology, the notion that our understanding of existence is heavily influenced both by the past and by a promised yet perpetually deferred future. The concept of hauntology haunted philosopher and musicologist Theodor Adorno, recognizing this in the 60s with the Beatles. For Adorno, the perennial melancholic, the haunting of the populist present by a recent modernist past undergoing a slow bastardization of its tropes and tunes through their glib repackaging and regurgitation, had already begun before the Beatles emerged. It was in fact the modus operandi of the culture industry. Adorno understood that in current industrial capitalist society, the primary function of art is in its commodity form, and this entailed the perpetual repackaging and regurgitation of various forms of art to various new consumer generations. Transgression and societal indictment, taking form in the 60s as psychedelia, was an afterthought or an impossibility when the structural arrangements prioritized profits. However, Adorno saw the dissonant operettas of Schoenberg as somehow cutting through the false rationality of industrial capitalism. Could the same be said of the dissonant metallic barrages in death and black metal? Perhaps. But could that not also be said of the Beatles in their time, with dissonant metallic barrages such as Helter Skelter? And if that is so, we already know of the bastardization of its tropes and tunes through glib repackaging and regurgitation. Mike Watson asserts that the repetitive cacophony of early heavy metal precursors, coming as the psychedelic scene began to sour, could be seen as a frank admission of LSD culture's failure and the impossibility of overcoming the twin forces of conservatism and capitalism, which had turned rebellion into commodified sellout concerts. It's no coincidence that metal grew out of the despair of psychedelia as the failed antidote to capitalism. As metal advanced and became more and more extreme, its subject matter becoming darker and more existential, its instrumentals pushing the boundaries of musical composition, combining both barely contained chaos and ultra-repetitive entrancements, the vocals further and further transcending human expression, all signifies a grasping of a possible distant future that remains ever distant, failing to constitute a new political or social reality. The many addictions that characterize our age signify a similar process of repetition, a kind of negative loop of trauma and addiction, with only a small possibility of escape. It's as if, in its constant changing, an exit is sought out by any means possible, and eventually only comes at the song's end, the death of the addictive cycle as death itself. Mike Watson here is referring to the many different parts and changes in the song Master of Puppets, in addition to its theme of drug addiction, but in my opinion this is applicable to most extreme metal. The hopelessness in life can understandably warrant the obsession or hopefulness of death. And in relation to extreme metal, and particularly its most hopeless fringe corners, an addiction to death. For this next part, we'll look at our contemporary death addicts, of whom make up the majority of what I'll call hopeless extreme metalisms, the black pillars and doomers. Mike Watson details the presence of right-wing incels and black pillars, essentially rejecting society and its ethical parameters as a means of processing perceived rejections from the labor market or the female gender. In lay terms, no job and no bitches. There's also a doomerist left presence online, consisting of those reflecting the desperation and lack of hope of a revolutionary future. This depressive hedonia, coinciding with the sense of disappointment and alienation in a data economy, according to Watson, is comparable with the catatonic effects of bourgeois morality and Christianity, identified by Nietzsche in the 19th century. Similar effects were later described by Adorno in relation to this rigidification of life under late capitalism as a mimesis of death. The mimesis of death is an interesting concept I want to discuss here. To put it simply, it's not going to be that simple. As a means of escaping the fear of our own mortality and the inevitability of our own deaths, we firmly adhere to behaviors and thought patterns that serve our data collecting economy for our own comfort and distract from any structural analysis or deeper meaning therein, again, for our own comfort. the adherence to this structure may not be explicit, but rather complicit. So, where the Christian in deep prayer in front of a religious icon assumes a position of stasis akin to the stillness of the inanimate matter that materially comprises the icon itself, the individual in front of their screen becomes less animate, even, than the data that entrances him or her. The question here is over the degree to which the meme, or more particularly the tendency to produce and consume memes repeatedly, represents an instance of the mimesis of death, seen in rigidified moral codes and ritual practices. These rigidified moral codes and ritual practices are, in modern internet culture, and especially amongst the black-pilled, the very memes we think of as working for us, but instead are only working to get themselves spread. We humans, because of our powers of imitation, have become just the physical hosts needed for the memes to get around. I know, memes may evoke images of fill-in-the-blank bullshit that's gonna date how old I am, but now might be a good time to bring up Memetics. While not an absolute science, it's definitely interesting and makes you reconsider the impact internet memes have on society across generations. For a definition, memes, akin to genes, are units of cultural information that can be communicated and replicated from one individual to another. The field of memetics is concerned with how memes spread, mutate, and evolve within societies, and it applies principles drawn from evolutionary biology to understand these processes. We are the hosts of memes, and they carry our cultural DNA, so to speak, or in other words, our moral codes and ritual practices. For example, the presence of Metallica may garner a mimetic reaction of calling them sellouts, or that Lars sucks, etc. You as an individual did not come to the novel conclusion of Lars sucking at drums. This information was replicated and spread through cultural information networks, or memes, and landed in you, the host. Amongst younger generations, and especially amongst metal fans, online interaction and meme replication such as this is extremely common. The perpetuation and consistent spread of memes like this solidifies the moral codes and ritual practices in metal circles. It's exceedingly rare to find metal circles that don't participate in similar codes and practices, which Keith Con Harris in his book Extreme Metal goes over, but I don't want to get too deep into this topic. Tangent aside, the predominantly online codes and rituals the black-pilled, nihilistic, and hopeless metal listeners engage in and perpetuate form their mimesis of death in front of the screen, very frequently taking form in shitposting and edgelordism, embracing both meaninglessness and senselessness, thwarting any attempts to signify deeper meaning. These attitudes have the potential of producing sharp satire that can target collective resentment towards a political or social injustice, as Nietzsche termed re-sentiment, but in these hopeless online circles, most of the time it produces a gnawing inertia in the individual as he or she becomes eaten up over a past, present, and potential future failures. The embittered individual, so sure of his worthlessness that they blight their own future. The self-blighting of their own future brings to mind incels, MGTOWs, self-proclaimed nihilists or misanthropes, and many other internet-centric hopeless individuals, choosing to mime death in front of their computer screens, overtaken by the inward gnawing of resentment. It's key to recognize these attitudes as a choice to deny life in favor of an addiction to death. Despite these online communities frequently idolizing Nietzsche and his epic-based mustache, and particularly in metal circles, his anti-Christianity, they frequently misunderstand his philosophy of, as Mike Watson puts it, almost hysteric life affirmation, his embrace of the Dionysian lifestyle, the revelry of saying yes to life's twists and turns, and a condemnation of the life-denying creed of Christianity, or Apollonian lifestyle, and analogously, today's life-denying processes, as such, are very much with us in the form of digital capitalism, hence demand that we lifelessly produce and consume new media on a near constant basis. This does not exclude your black pill montages and DSBM edits. Speaking of frequent misinterpretations, it's kind of a recurring joke amongst critiques of the online alt-right and neo-Nazis of their tendency to appropriate any number of things, typically popular, attractive things, and often innocent things like anime girls or cartoons. It's no coincidence that these things, like MGMT's Little Dark Age or Feels Bad Man Pepe, have that depressive, hopeless aesthetic and are indicative of the addiction to death. Despite the inclusion of Little Dark Age to a montage of Nietzsche quotes, the crux of Nietzsche's critique against the over-codified and rigid Christian, or Apollonian attitude, is embodied in those very same codified online behaviors. Today's online activity, which despite often appearing erratic and uncontrolled, leaves the internet user arguably devoid of both the Dionysian and Apollonian poles of being. In this sense, to meme with no Dionysian or Apollonian input is to mime death, as the frantic activity of copy-pasting images and texts, posting them online, and then entering into a barrage of discussion before repeating the process, leaves one immobile in front of a screen. In the age of data capitalism, the social media addict befalls the same fate as the religious zealot in front of a Christian icon. In this light, far from being edgy, the individual meme poster fully supports the status quo in their inaction. The memes they post may prompt outraged responses, but this will only lock them into further posting activity and a continual process of objectification. I'll admit, the usage of terms like Dionysian and Apollonian, and basically most of this video, and most of my videos in general, is going to be wordy or overly intellectual, etc. But mainly what needs to be understood is the primary effect material reality has on our psyche and mental health. Again, I'm not going to delve too deep into it right now, but Mark Fisher has lots of good writings on the topic of mental health, and how our frameworks of understanding it are so intertwined with our material reality in capitalist society, which can trap us in cycles of ineffective remedies centered around self-help and insular solutions, without addressing systemic root causes. It is as if therapeutic practice, and by extension the dialogue of self-help, has become victim to the same inability to deal with material reality that catalyzes mental illness in the first place. That was a more general discussion of the codification and spread of hopelessness amongst particularly young internet users, but now we'll get more into the particulars of this dichotomy amongst metal listeners, of whom often are not separate from the aforementioned dynamics. It's only a MP3 file away from turning the Hitler Little Dark Age edit into a Shining Hitler edit, attracting the very same demographics interested in avoiding confrontations with mortality by miming death itself in comfortable internet spaces. Metal that evokes a depressive and hopeless attitude draws from a powerful attribute of metal, according to Keith Con Harris and David Burke: destruction. Metal has its greatest impact due to its destructive capabilities, destroying societal boundaries and inhibitions, as well as destroying feelings of comfort and security. Whether it be sonically or aesthetically, metal has a strong tendency to destroy in various different ways. This destruction can be useful in a revolutionary sense in ridding society of unnecessary taboos and mores, but also in negative ways, such as destroying unity, or, as it pertains to this discussion, turned inwards and directed towards oneself. The destructive power of metal is turned into self-destruction, eliminating any possibility of community or acceptance of life in favor of perpetual sorrow, a wallowing in misery, a mimesis of death. Self-destruction is helplessness. People are helpless. They have no other choice, so self-destruction gives them relief. Scott Connor of popular DSBM outfit Zaster embodies this destructive tendency by confronting life trauma and hopelessness with extreme isolation. In fact, Connor makes it known that the music he creates purposely may assist its listeners in taking their own lives. Similarly, Nicholas Cavarforth of Shining makes it abundantly clear his intention of his music to nurture hopelessness and self-destruction. In fact, Commodifying has said, suicide is very individual in some cases. People just kill themselves because they can't stand living. That's sad because I would like them to suffer more instead. Commodifying is notoriously a twisted guy, but this quote really exemplifies the addiction to death, in its desire not only for death itself in a literal sense, but for the suffering its mimesis entails, the blighting of their own futures. Taking even a short listen to either of these projects leaves the listener painfully aware of this intention. Simply put, the music is dismal, despondent, and desolate. The vocal style exudes pain and torment, rather than sounding like a possessed demon in more traditional black metal. The music in DSBM is even more monotonous and epic as well as atmospheric. It's not so hateful to others, but to oneself and being. There are many other examples of depressive black metal artists explicitly citing their music as projects in hopelessness. But, conversely, there are artists who aim for this music as a means of coping or reflection. Referring to his intent for Stride, Edvard Rodseth said, "At the time, we wanted to isolate from society in the modern world. We felt a lot of anger and hate towards what might be said to be an invisible enemy. It wasn't just Christianity, which within the scene was the obvious nemesis, but everything that had contributed to bring our existence to the present situation with decay in more or less every aspect of the world and culture. Instead of expressing these emotions through aggressive and fast black metal, we aimed for expressing the sorrow we felt when reflecting upon and observing the decay around us." Russell Menzies of Striborg has said depressive black metal is an art form which suggested that it was okay to talk deeply and openly about your feelings, and therefore accepted. The experiences and intentions of these and other DSBM artists exemplify the range of ways in which the hopelessness of life can be addressed, and this is but one particular subsection of a subgenre on the fringes of music. If one thing can be taken from this, it's that there are other avenues to choose, other than the black-pilled mimesis of death in front of a comforting sinkhole of hopelessness. What comes after the descent into the abyss is a choice. There's an unlikely message of hope in DSBM, like the integration of brighter sounds and post-black metal, or implicit, like how earlier acts have managed to persist, using their dark days to keep making new art. The result is a whole museum of art that is unified by darkness, but aware of the light that lurks just around the corner. It's up to you to peer around the edge of your screen to see that light.
Coming from like a very Asian family, so a lot of the stereotypes are kind of true. Like I was always kind of put in competition with my cousins about who can be like the most successful firstborn son. Um, I always joke about it, but for like a little bit of context, I have a cousin that goes to Harvard. He has a little brother that now goes to Yale. And as of this year, their littlest brother just got accepted into Princeton. So the competition is at its peak right now. Um, on top of all like this kind of competing stuff, I was never really able to like, I don't want to say like I didn't have a childhood, but like a lot of priorities were shifted growing up. And on top of that, I wasn't really able to kind of like discover who I was. I also come from a household where um I guess mental health isn't real. So I never knew how to like deal with that kind of stuff growing up. And it led to a lot of fucked up things with me that I haven't really recovered from now. I think especially it got really bad during COVID. Um that was like when like all the depression stuff really like boiled over because like I was isolated from everybody, and for some reason my mom was just like the worst during that time. Like that was like the first kind of time I can recall actually trying to like do things like kill myself. Um it was a really rough patch to get through, but I mean I kind of just thugged it out. I I can't say that I've recovered from those days, but like I'm like in a better place now. Yeah. Definitely did not help that I was I think I do this joke in the one of my videos, but like I'm an art student that got rejected from art school, and
Uh-huh.
I have like all these like really successful ass like family. It's awful. I feel like I was always gonna find metal with how different I was. But I think with all this kind of like emotional turmoil inside of me, I think I'm kind of surprised I didn't find it earlier. I was always kind of surrounded by metal, but going out on my own to actually find it was like a long time. That should have came earlier. I when I started listening to metal, I wasn't really as like emotionally involved as I am now. I just really liked like having a genre of music that actually sounded like I enjoyed listening to it because
Mhm.
I was always around like an R&B mom. Uh, I mean I love that music to death. I love like generally speaking a lot of like genres of music, but like if I were to have a genre that I could say was me, especially when I discovered it, it'd have to be metal. I have unfortunately seen my fair share of Nazis in the comments.
Oh,
Somehow,
really?
it's actually kind of crazy. I'm not surprised. That's partially why I'm like afraid of talking about black metal a lot, especially since like I'm trying to like deviate a little. Um
Hey, Nazis
I
stopped existing in 1945, by the way.
okay, yeah, that's true.
Just your imagination.
It's National Socialists as they like to be
Right.
called. It's
Completely different.
I like making fun of them, but like in the back of my head, I know that given the internet, there are some pretty rabid people. So I'm kind of picking my battles with who I make fun of in the comments. But like overall, I mean, they're on the internet. They shouldn't be able to find me, so I should be good to go. I'd say on the emotional level, black metal. I mean, yes, it helps on like getting a lot of stuff out, but it doesn't really confront the problems. Like that's an unfortunate thing that I deal with. I also have a mom that doesn't really believe in therapy, so I don't really have any kind of thing to really talk about my feelings with. So I all I really have is metal, but even then, I know that's not probably the healthiest thing to rely on in terms of uh dealing with all that hopelessness and shit. Like, I mean, it acknowledges it, but it doesn't do anything to get rid of it. It just kind of brings it all back up.
You pretty much predicted my video,
Yeah,
honestly. But
yeah,
it's like shit is fucked up, and like that's it.
yeah.
It kind of ends there.
Yeah,
But
you just kind of put it on the shelf until you need to talk about it again.
yeah,
It's kind of ironic, especially considering like people hate when like especially black metal does this, but it's introduced me to a lot of people. Like finding other people that love this genre as much as I do, it's like given me all these new friends, especially with the YouTube channel. A lot of my subscribers have become like really close mutuals because like we have such a strong love for like such a horrible genre of music to bond over. And then I mean, so I did say that like it doesn't necessarily confront a lot of the problems I have, but it still is some kind of an outlet. Like being able to just scream out and like having all these bands that kind of like not all of them, some of them do have like lyrics and imagery where they kind of sing about what they're going through or they use their music to like let out their own personal stuff, whether or not that be problematic. But it's still, I mean, all music is pretty kind of emotional, but like I feel like metal especially is one of those genres where like you can really feel everybody letting all their kind of stuff, all their issues just out in the open and like there's some kind of catharsis to that.
hmm it's just different.
Yeah. I don't think necessarily like genres like neoclassical metal are about letting out emotions like that, but I know like
Right.
thrash is like a very angsty genre. Like a lot of like angry teenagers let out their stuff through that. There's
Right.
of course there's black metal. Everybody kind of just has like all these fucked up violent thoughts that they let out through the genre.
Neoclassical is more like a flexing,
Yes, that's
flexing your
straight up.
chops.
Yeah. It's flexing, but without coming off like Motley Crue or the hair metal bands.
Right. Yeah, it's flexing what's outside of your pants.
Mm-hmm. It's flexing what the fingers do.
From a practical standpoint, there are a plethora of reasons for someone to feel hopeless, especially those of younger generations who grew up with the internet. We don't find as much enjoyment in the things we used to, and nostalgia dominates so much of our desires. The essentials of life are more and more expensive: housing, food, education, healthcare. Your family is getting older and or more distant and consumed into their own mimesis of death in front of their own screens. Bombardments of devastating news from around the world showing inhuman brutality and the inhuman reaction or ignorance of those around us. perpetuated by an inhuman societal structure, separating insular worlds and prioritizing the merciless extraction of data and profits from us. Our only consolation? A cheeseburger and a smartphone, of which an endless carousel of perpetuated misery is displayed, sometimes peddling pseudoscientific solutions, and other times feeding you the desired vindication for hopelessness in the form of a black-pilled memes. In this dark and hopeless reality, it's understandable to think that the only way that something deserves an emotional reaction from us is if it has a little dark age or life lover playing in the background. But this is only if death is prematurely enacted. Death is inevitable, but life must be sought out, of which you only have one opportunity to do so. Why squander that opportunity for life by miming death?